So welcome everybody and hello. I'm Louise Pryor, President of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth event in our Thought Leadership webinar series focusing on sustainability issues, and we're calling this series The Road to Glasgow. We're holding this series throughout the autumn ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, hence the name, and I'm so pleased to be chairing it during my presidential year at what is a critical moment for climate action, and I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their support in delivering this series. Our platinum sponsor is Milliman, and we also have our sponsor Star Actuarial Futures Limited. As I said, the series is part of the IFoA's 2021 Thought Leadership Programme, where we're seeking to convene leading experts, thinkers and decision makers with our global membership so that we can debate the key sustainability issues of our time, which intersect both actuarial work and the interests of wider society. Through the series, we aim to provide a platform for prominent contributors so that our members and others can understand the perspectives of a wide range of parties interested in the climate debate. From the implications of the climate crisis for insurance and investment to the global role of actuaries, the path to net zero and the importance of biodiversity, the series features discussions across a range of topics relevant to the work of actuaries. All the events in the series are free to attend, and you can register through the events page on the IFoA website. So today's event focuses on climate justice and intergenerational fairness. The impacts of climate change will not be borne equally or fairly between rich and poor, women and men, and older and younger generations. Globally, those most at risk often have the least influence on the factors affecting climate change. And this is true across current populations and future populations. Consequently, there's been a growing focus on climate justice, which looks at the climate crisis through a human rights lens and on the belief that by working together, we can create a better future for present and future generations. There are many policy issues where a long-term view is essential if we're going to meet today's needs without putting younger or future generations or certain cohorts at a disadvantage. And climate is one of those issues. For some years now, the IFoA has increasingly analysed the impact of policymaking on future generations, especially in the field of ageing populations. However, there's a growing drive to consider climate in this way too, and actuaries are well placed to deploy their understanding of the long term to address the challenges this debate poses. Let me give you an example of the problem. Somebody born in 1950 in the UK has a lifetime carbon allowance of 794 tonnes of CO2 if global warming is going to be kept to within 1.5 degrees. But for someone born in 2000, the lifetime allowance is just 256 tonnes, less than a third of the 794 tonnes. 50 years makes a lot of difference. And this means that Generation Z will have a very different life to that of their grandparents, who are the boomers. And that's if we achieve the Paris aim. If we fail to achieve the Paris aim, the effect will be even more pronounced, as global GDP has been estimated to be 45% lower in 2100 if global warming is 4 degrees than it would be if it was 1.5 degrees. So the effects on future generations and to future us too, because these effects are not just in the long term, they're in the short to medium term as well. The effects are immense. I'm therefore delighted to have our expert panel to provide their perspectives on the challenge in front of us. As part of this session, I'm going to ask them to explore the extent to which intergenerational fairness is being considered in climate policies, to share their insights from other countries who are leading the way on fairness and justice in climate interventions, and comment on how younger and often marginalised sections of society can be given a more prominent voice in climate politics. And of course, we'll be also commenting on how the actuarial profession can support a just transition that doesn't punish future generations. So I can now introduce today's speakers. Fantastic panel. Firstly, we've got Jane Davidson, Pro Vice Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. She was previously Cabinet Minister for Education, then for Environment and Sustainability in Wales, where she proposed legislation to make sustainability the central organising principle of government. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act came into law in 2015. Jane is the author of Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country, available in all good bookstores, and is passionate about living lightly. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and guest faculty on the Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership Programme at Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Our second panelist is Kudzai Chigiji, founder of Africans Thinking, who's joining us from Johannesburg today. Kudzai is a fellow of the IFoA and of the Actuarial Society of South Africa, or ASA, where she chairs the Banking Committee. Her experience spans life insurance, management consulting, healthcare consulting, impact investing, social security development, data analytics, and banking. Kudzai has served on several boards within South Africa and the UK and has a Master's in Development Finance from the UCT Graduate School of Business and holds a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Oxford Said Business School. And our third panelist today is Alice Bordini-Staden from the Intergenerational Foundation and Managing Director of GLC Advisors. Alice has 23 years experience in investment management and stewardship and is an investment committee member at the National Trust, Europe's largest conservation charity, leading its investor stewardship activities. She's also an advisory panel member of the Financial Reporting Council. Alice is an advisor in shareholder engagement for the non-profit environmental law organisation Client Earth, consulting on climate-related corporate legal strategies in Europe and Asia, and an advisory council member for the all-party parliamentary group in sustainable finance in the UK Parliament. So as you can see, between them, they've got a wealth of experience and expertise. I'm going to ask each of them in turn to make some short opening remarks before we open up to a panel discussion and questions from the floor. Please submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. We will pick them up in the second half of the event, but do feel free to put them in the box at any time. And let's get started. So Jane, if you go first, please.
Thank you so much, Louise, and I'm delighted to be joining you at this very, very important seminar today. I thought that what I'd like to do is explicitly focus on some of the work that has been done in Wales in trying to redraw the framework for how we should consider future generations in legislation. And I think this is very important because when we're going to focus on systems thinking, unless we actually look upstream in terms of changes, it's very difficult to change things downstream because they often have unintended consequences. And I thought, considering I know I'm talking to a set of professionals, probably one of the largest sets of professionals gathered together who understand how to measure and manage risk. I raise this fundamental question for those of us who are not actuaries and not investors in this sense about how we can be in this situation. If we look at the country overshoot day for this year, it is running at the end of July. It actually went back to the end of August last year during COVID. And when I first became interested in country overshoot days, which is in the very early 2000s, it was the end of September. Now, those dates I'm mentioning and this chart shows the date by which the country's share of the ecological resources of the world is depleted. And if we look at Qatar, that's in early February. So we're in a situation where most countries in the world, and certainly all the development countries in the world, sit on the right-hand side of this chart. And that tells us that in terms of risk, we have massive risk to the survival of the human race. And just if we think about those 20 years since I first discovered this measurement, and now we are losing about a month a decade. So if we think about the overall situation now being at the end of July, we are only 60 years away before it is all gone. Now that is the sort of situation we're in at a global level. And in Wales, small country, we actually, by deciding to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, became the first country in the world to deliver on a legal mechanism for the Sustainable Development Goals. So you see those round the content of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And what is interesting about the Act is it's not just about the goals as contained in there, but the ways of working, how you deliver on those goals, are also on this chart. Public services in Wales have to think long-term, be preventative, be collaborative, to integrate outcomes and involve people about whom decisions are being made. And the goals here totally reframe, in a sense, where investment works at government level in Wales. It has to be low carbon. It has to reflect the limits of the global environment. It has to act on climate change. When we think about resilience, it has to not just maintain, but enhance a biodiverse natural environment. It has to try and contribute towards physical and mental well-being of the population. So all of this looks upstream. It's not about the small outcomes that change the current systems. It's about, if we ripped it up and started again, what would we do for our populations in terms of giving them and future generations as yet unborn the best possible chance in life? And that last goal, in terms of global responsibility, is linked to the idea that actually what you don't do is offshore your own emissions. But actually, if you're going to do this seriously, you have to do it in a way that what you do in your country and what you do in relation to other countries is the same. Because if we really believe in supporting future generations, we should be listening to John Rawls, the American philosopher, who said, "Do unto future generations what you would have had past generations do unto you." So the challenge of this sector at this time, coming up to the COP, is why is climate not an equivalent risk to morbidity and mortality? Thank you.
I'll remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Jane. That was absolutely great. And of course, we at the IFoA have said that we want actuaries to be looking at climate risk in the same breath, as it were, give it the same prominence as mortality and interest rate risks are. So thank you for reinforcing that message. Kudzai, over to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. And it's always a pleasure listening to Jane talk about her work. And it's always very inspiring. And my job here today is probably to provoke and challenge more so than to inspire, but I hope I inspire you as well. And a lot of the people on this call are also actuaries. And one of the things that I love the most about being an actuary is that we are a highly respected profession. We are considered to be trusted advisors. And one of the things that's often said about actuaries is that we serve in the best interest of the public. And secondly, we make financial sense of the future. It's a really exciting time to be a young person in the world that we live in today. I'm a millennial, one of the younger millennials, and I look around and it's just so exciting to be alive right now. The pace at which things are changing, some good, some bad, but everything presenting a challenge, and with that, an opportunity. However, I look at the changes around me and I look at our profession, and sometimes I feel that we've lost sight of the future and we spend a lot of time looking at the past. or doing things the way they've been done in the past. The profession has become very report-centric. And there's always a report for something, what happened in the past or what we think is going to happen in the future. But if I look at the pace of innovation in the world and the pace of innovation with which we have done our work, I think there's definitely a disconnect. And I've seen this in several environments that I've worked in, though I have had the great privilege to work in a lot of product development and research and development teams. And I guess my call to action is really, what about an actuary's work helps us to put action behind the information that we have? We have such great intellectual prowess and ability to solve such complex problems. And sometimes I wonder if we bring that to the fore. And that's in, like I said, the product development that we do, in helping to advise people about the future, about what we're seeing. Are we adequately educating ourselves and one another to make sure that we can make sense of the future as rapidly as it is changing? Something my mother has often said, and I've picked up also in books, that information without action is poverty. And I think that is the real existential crisis that we have for our profession. Are we putting action behind the great information, the great education that we've received, the great privilege that we have to be part of this very highly respected profession? And like I told you, I'm one of the younger millennials, and I often look to older individuals who are Gen X and, baby boomers, some much older. And I look to the younger generation, the Gen Zs and the digital natives, and I find myself really at a crossroads. We've inherited a world that isn't fair. And I'm not apologetic about saying that. And I don't want the world that I inherited to be passed on to the next generation. And I really feel that we are at a time in the world where it's probably a good time to disrupt a lot of things. One of the things, like I said earlier, is that we say that we are here to make financial sense of the future. And part of that is that we work in financial services. Insurance, we're right at the middle. Pensions, we're right at the middle. Healthcare funding, we're there as well. Banking, we've moved in with great force. And as you've heard, that's one of the areas that I look after within ASA. Investments, we're also considered trusted advisors across asset management across the world. After all, one of the greatest pools of capital is within pension funds and reinsurance and insurance organizations. So as actuaries, if we sit in the middle of all of this capital that can be used for good, what's stopping us? Are we really taking responsibility for how this capital is used, or are we just writing reports? Are we just submitting reports and giving justifications for assumptions that might or might not be used at times? Or are we really challenging ourselves as a profession to do what is right, not just by ourselves, but by future generations? It's hard to believe, but climate change is as urgent, if not more, than the pandemic that we're still recovering from. And I witnessed for myself the great fervor that the whole profession really rallied behind, whether it was healthcare actuaries, whether it was general insurance actuaries. I've really seen actuaries across the globe reorganize themselves and take what can only be described as Herculean efforts to make sense of what was going on and to have some kind of impact. And I hope that we see that same pace and that same urgency with climate change going forward. I think the time for having, for pontificating, if I can call it that, and having intellectual discussions has gone. It's time for us to put some action behind all of our words and our intellectual prowess. So it's time for us to be the key trusted advisors that we believe we are, and to be one of the key voices to perhaps make financial sense of a world where climate change is no longer an impending threat, but a reality. And yeah, with this, I think I'll hand over back to you, Louise.
Thank you, Kudzai. A real call to action there. I can see Jane appreciates it too. This is absolutely one of the things we're trying to do with our recent climate change statement. We are calling on actuaries to try and make the world a better place. It's really important. So Alice, over to you.
Hello, thanks so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be talking about the intersection of two topics I'm really passionate about: climate change and intergenerational justice. And I'm particularly pleased because in my world, sustainable finance, when we talk about climate justice, we typically refer to poor nations or ethnic minorities, which are, of course, climate victims. However, in fact, the climate change is the quintessential example of intergenerational unfairness. because if we think about it, as a first approximation, everyone of every generation has probably benefited indirectly or directly from degrading the environment. And the wealthier they are more likely to have benefited. And so in the period 1970 to 2021 is when most of the damage has been sustained. So our generation is the largest contributor to climate change. And it's a first that knows without a shred of a doubt that it's anthropogenic. And it's a first that has created a credible and workable roadmap to stop the damage and transition to a sustainable world for the future generations. And it's the last one that can do something about it. And in fact, I would say we don't have our generation to do something about it. We have 10 years. We have 10 years to stop it from running away from us. So the problem is very complex, but today, as having a finance background, I would like to touch on two particular aspects: how much this is going to cost and how to do it. Now, how much? We all know it's going to cost a lot of money, which developed nations will largely have to bear to transition themselves and help poor countries. Globally, however, the debt to GDP, if we consider all debt, is twice of what it was in 1965. And you know, I could say point, I couldn't agree more. The pandemic was tragic, but it wasn't existential to us as a human race. And climate change is potentially. And so the amount of debt that was incurred by nations from the pandemic is taken it to such levels that it's really difficult to see how these national governments can increase the level of debt much more. And it's already approaching hardly sustainable levels. And as we know, that's going to be paid off by the future generations. Because in the past, the traditional way to deal with large debt was to grow your way out of it. But for the first time in history, we are pushing the boundaries of the planet. The environment just can't cope with never-ending doubling of GDP. So, you know, think about carbon emissions and biodiversity impact, and, you know, we're just running out of space. And what Jane was saying, it's absolutely right. We just don't have much carbon budget left, and the rate we're destroying biodiversity is absolutely tragic. So the bill is getting bigger and bigger every year that we delay action, and it's falling more and more onto younger generations. And the price of delay will soon become unbearable if we leave it any longer. So on how to do it. So it concerns me that the toolbox is getting smaller as the time is running short and the range of options is reducing. Now, the problem is compounded by increasing emissions and decreasing natural sinks that feed onto each other and compound the problem. Now, we know what we need to do, both as private sector and public sector. And we all know that there is commitment of $100 billion a year that developed nations have to put on the table to help developing nations to transition. And there are many great initiatives and commitments that us as private sector are working on and involved in, but really the real difference will be made by strong and coordinated policy response. There is no doubt that the biggest chunk of this 100 billion will be private capital, and there is lots of private capital, lots of institutional investors, pension funds that have this money that they want. They have to find a place to deploy it. But we need very strong action from the policymakers to make it possible, to start this virtuous feedback loop, where by policy, by creating a tangible and credible and equitable policy framework that removes uncertainty on the direction of travel and that give confidence to private capital, will incentivize the flow of private capital. And so policymakers have to create a clear regulatory, fiscal, and investment framework which de-risks private investments. So by doing so and supporting investments in technology it will give the confidence to private capital to flow in, will allow the proof of concept, economies of scale, and just like it happened with solar and wind energy, will lower the cost by just sheer virtue of economies of scale by doing more and more. It will provide the economics, and then once the economics are there, the system our capitalist system will work, and will have the buy-in from society. So it's we have an opportunity now to do it. It's very important that there is no more procrastination, no more talking from policymakers, because if we don't, it's not just about, you know, the astronomical bill and living conditions and heat pumps or floods and fires, but we're facing mass migration. We're facing potentially half of the world population that has to move north, because otherwise they won't survive. And, you know, we remember what happened in Europe with 1.3 million migrants in 2015. We're talking potentially about billions of people wanting to move. So hopefully this year at COP, we'll see some real progress. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we all hope that, and we all hope that the progress is going to be based on solid action rather than just more words. Yeah. Talking of words, yeah, Alice pointed out that people say, but we can't afford to do it. We can't afford to spend the money now to stop disaster happening in the future. Where, I mean, the obvious response, the one that I usually make, is, but we can't afford not to, because of the you know, the risks that the impacts are just going to be much bigger than monetary, much bigger than anything we can spend now. But how can we get that message across, that it's a question of spending a comparatively small amount when looked in a lot of different contexts? I mean, like worldwide defense spending, for example, many other examples, a comparatively small amount globally compared to a comparatively large amount in monetary terms, and an even larger amount in emotional, psychological terms, if you like, for people in the future. How can we make that point better to politicians, and indeed to the voters as well, who the politicians do listen to in the end quite a lot? Jane, an ex-politician.
Thanks. I mean, I think what interests me about this discussion is that people, organizations, always in a sense ask somebody else to make the decisions. So in the discussions that we've just had in the last few minutes, there's a very clear notion that how do we get the politicians to make the decisions? But I operate on the basis that, you know, if we're talking about an existential crisis to humanity, which every single one of us on this call accepts is the case, the question is not if, the question is when, and the question is what action we take. We're all very keen on action to mitigate that. Then actually every single one of us has to be looking at answers, because some of the answers will come from politicians. And I think the biggest show of faith in the context of COP is going to be for the budget created by the global north for the use by the global south. And I just don't think COP is going to go anywhere if that money is not there, because, you know, we have caused the problem, and therefore that debt has to be fully acknowledged and delivered in that context, and that will enable people to come to the table to have a proper conversation. But I mean, going back to the point of the question I asked Louise about, you know, if for people who are professional in terms of risk management, how can we be in a situation, and this is not just about actuaries, this is about investment, this is about decision making, how can we be in a situation where the risks are transferred away from the climate? So climate itself has not been perceived to be a risk in any of these decisions, but we sit in old fossil fuel funding arrangements because they've been inherently there for many, many decades. So I think it's a question of saying, well, how do you create a level playing field so that investors don't need to step up ahead, actuaries don't need to behave in different kinds of ways, but the parameters under which they operate change as a result of the proper recognition of this existential risk. So my proposition for testing is that if we had a level playing field where climate now becomes the same kind of risk as mortality and morbidity for actuaries and for all investment houses, both public and private, actually that is game changing, because that keeps fossil fuels in the ground.
Yes, I think that's a really important question, and I'm just going to take Chair's privilege actually just to spout off a bit about some of my own concerns. One of my big concerns is actually that we talk about climate risk. Climate is not a risk. Climate is a certainty. Climate change is happening, and we know roughly how much and how fast it is happening now. The risk, the uncertainty comes in, we don't know what the impacts are. And one of the problems that I find is that people don't like facing up to the full range of possibilities. So people say, oh, don't be such a doom monger when you point out about all the bad things that could happen. But the point is that it is our responsibility as actuaries to highlight the full range of possible impacts, which absolutely includes the worst possible. As actuaries, we are not, or we shouldn't be, about saying what we think the most likely thing is to happen. We should be talking about the full range, especially on the bad side, because that's where the risk management bit comes in. So, sorry, that's just my sort of two pennyworth on that. And it's a really important point, Jane, and thank you for highlighting that. Kudzai, I know you wanted to come in on this. Still on mute. There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Louise. And I think to, starting off with what Alice was sharing with us is definitely there's a role for public sector to play in incentivizing private capital to move in the direction of solutions that are more climate friendly. But also to Jane's point, and something that you said as well, we don't need to imagine anymore. You just need to keep up to date with the news in the US to get an idea of how drastic climate change is at the moment. It's either you're looking at the West Coast and there's a fire almost nonstop throughout the year. You look at the East Coast and there is some kind of tornado. There's flooding right all the way up to New York and Maine. You look at the South, which is either extremely cold or extremely hot, and you see people already starting to think of, where do I move to if I don't want this to be my reality. We saw the flooding in Europe earlier this year. So we're getting a very good taste of what the world is likely to look like in the near future. And it's not, I can talk about the examples in developing and emerging economies as well, but not to belabor the point, I really do believe that private capital needs to step up. And it's not just about reconfiguring the pieces, within the parameters they currently exist. And Jane pointed this out, we actually need to move the parameters out and say that these products don't work if it's financial products, if it's capital market instruments, and we need to reimagine something very different. And something you mentioned that I think is quite important is that sometimes we're very limited in the pools of capital we think are available to us. We've seen even in the UK, sometimes the fines from banks are used to fund the NHS. Trust me, when the problem is big enough and you're serious enough about it, somehow we always do find the money. If it's a war, we find the money. If it's the NHS about to fall apart, we find the money. If it's mining in Africa, and some of us make things happen. And I think it's very important. And again, I point this out, as actuaries, we spend so many years stretching our minds and trying to figure out how we can build these complex instruments and how we can influence the flow of capital and transfer risk and manage it better. So I do not think this is an insurmountable challenge. I believe we actually just have not applied our minds well enough. And I think I'll leave it there and hand it over to you. And I see Alice has her hand up.
Yeah, Alice, go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to contribute on this money issue. Nobody doubts that there is an extraordinary amount of money that should be on the table, and it's not on the table. This 100 billion, we are at about 80 now, so we are not so far off from meeting the 100 billion, at least for a year now, for poorer countries. However, that is just not enough, in which there is on one side the helping poorer nations to transition, and they have an absolute right to be helped because they are not responsible for this. And I was looking at a chart, for example, the other day. It was planning, well, if you take into account land use change and deforestation, who are the nations that contributed the most in our history, in the fossil fuel era, to carbon emissions? And the US is by a long margin the first one, but then there's China, and then there's Russia, and there is Indonesia, and people point out, well, you see, after all, those are poor nations. Well, no, those are the scope 3 of us in developed markets. So essentially, those are the products, those are emissions that have been created to pay for our own consumption. So nobody doubts that. But however, we need to reduce emissions in our own rich countries, because otherwise we're never going to make it. We've got to stop increasing our emissions. And of course, that requires a lot of money. And the private money is there, but when I say, I'm a great believer in policy, because the role of governments have, it's very important. They've got to create the right investment environment for private money, and it's still not there. So on one side, as I said earlier, the right framework, but on the other, they should tax appropriately. On one side, fossil fuels and polluting activities, or if not tax, stop subsidizing it. And it's still extraordinary, the amount of subsidies, direct or very often indirect fossil fuel subsidies in the world, and start subsidizing the solutions, the climate solutions. So it's And just on Luisa's point on disclosures, it's absolutely true. I mean, I spend a lot of time during my typical day engaging with companies, and we want disclosures, and we want this the climate, we call it climate risk, the financial impacts of climate to be properly reflected in the accounts. And there is, of course, there is variability, because it's not just the physical risk that we're trying to model, and we want our companies and actuaries to reflect properly in their accounts, but it's also transition risk, and that is the direction of travel of regulation, and how soon or how late the policy action will enforce certain transition, or it will be consumer preferences, etc. So it's a difficult thing to get right, but I think we all have our role to play.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alice. There's a question just come in that I think speaks to, or doesn't speak to this question, but sort of teases out some of this a bit more. So to what extent is the risk treatment of climate change in investment decisions undermined by the asymmetry of risk and reward, the benefits accruing principally to the investor and the risks largely transferring to the global population? And if this is a problem, which I suspect many people might think it is, do we have a mechanism for correcting it? Does anyone want to come in on that? Alice again, and then we'll go to maybe Kudzai.
I'm happy to give it a first stab.
Yeah.
Well, I disagree that investors don't have the risk. Of course, people bear, and especially in poorer countries or in certain geographies, bear ultimately a huge amount of risk, but investors as well, because as regulation will change, we are confident it will change, and as investor action gets stepped up, those companies will not be able to continue doing what they're doing. You know, the amount of fossil fuel reserves that oil companies, energy companies have on their books now will largely have to stay in the ground. And so we're talking about, you know, famous concept of stranded assets. So investors are facing potentially a steep losses themselves if they remain invested, if they stay invested in assets that are overvalued as they are now to a large extent. So I quite agree that the risk is skewed, but I wouldn't say that the risk is not there for investors, and that's why we're working very hard to try and push companies to transition and to have a net zero plan, whilst we wait for governments to actually step up policy so that it becomes easier and faster, because it's slow now, you know, just left to us.
Kutsai, do you have anything on this?
Yes, definitely. And this is a space I've been operating in for the past few years, and have, you know, formed some thinking around. So firstly, to Alice's point, the license to operate. You know, once upon a time it was you had to talk to the community if you wanted to open a mine there, set up a, you know, clinic or a school. Nowadays, it's as simple as what are the conditions that your workers halfway across the world work in, and what are your products? What do they do to the environment? The plastic that is used to develop them. So really that definition of license to operate shifting, also as we're seeing a shift in sort of the main consumers by generation. I think particularly Gen Zs and young are very, very particular about this sort of thing. But another thing is also, I guess, more mainstream around impact investing. And I know sort of it's still very much a wishy-washy space, and some people aren't quite sure what it's about. And some people even cringe at the idea of calling themselves impact investors. And what I think is going to happen over the next decade is that will become much like sustainability reporting or ESG, where it's just everyone's going to be an impact investor, because everyone is going to be required to measure their returns also off of the type of impact that they're having in their communities, whether good or bad. And, you know, something I'm often telling people is that, you know, as much as math is a natural science, a lot of the work we do is man-made. So our definition of a return is largely man-made, and we can change it. And I think that's definitely what we're seeing in the impact investing space. And like I said, it's going to be penalized for the harmful impact that you have on, you know, the community around you, the people around you, the environment around you, and you'll need to adjust your returns to your investors based off of this. Again, probably not happening fast enough, but I think that is where the investment landscape is going.
Thank you. And Jane?
I think there is a sort of massive gap between rhetoric and action. And I go back to the point that politics has an enormous role to play in this, but it is not the only role, because politics generally is about moving public money, taxpayers' money, to distribute in for public good. Whereas you work mostly with people who are not delivering on taxpayers' money. And if we're going to get the right sort of impact investments for our time, if we are, and absolutely accept that, you know, Alice's point about we are going to have to keep fossil fuels in the ground, which is something I've been arguing for years politically, then actually, yeah, the risk is going to change. But you have a major opportunity, the investment houses, the actuaries, of going to government and saying, this must be in the regulations that govern what we do. And we would like it to look like this. Because otherwise government will try and do something to you that the professions will reject. And if there's going to be a level playing field, why not define your own level playing field so that actually you're part of the solution by defining under what terms X happens? And I think there's just too much the idea that we leave it all to politicians, that politicians come in with an agenda anyway. They are mandated by the public to deliver on the agenda they have set. And yet that agenda may be nothing to do with the crises facing us. And that's a particular issue, I think, for us in the UK at the moment, is we had a government that came in on one agenda, particularly around getting Brexit done. And there are all sorts of crises consequent on that. But that is not a government that, other than rhetoric, has ever committed itself in any regulation in terms of the delivery of all those things that we need in the context of future generations. So offer it to them, offer up the opportunity. You are the people who know your ambit best. You are the people who know your context best. Would it be possible for the profession to think collaboratively, long-term, preventatively, involve people about whom decisions are being made and integrate outcomes, which is what's required on every public service in Wales, and why other countries in the world are looking at what Wales has done in legislation? Because it's really hard to be a front runner here, really hard to go out separately. And you might create a niche role for yourself. You might factor in climate in every decision that a group of actuaries might make, or an investment house might make. But for the rest of us, it's got to be everyone who does that. And the trouble is, if you don't offer up solutions, then government will either not do it, or they might do it in a way that is not understanding the pressures on you. And I think, going back to Alice's point, I think one of the most exciting things in the sort of keep fossil fuels in the ground and regulation approach, because I think, Alice, you and I are talking about the same thing with different words, because for me, policy is a very small part of a mechanism, as somebody who's been a politician, because policy can be changed by any government who comes in afterwards. Regulation has to be changed in law. So I'm behind law and regulation as the means of actually defining effective outcomes. And I think there is a quick lesson from Wales on regulation, which is that we are now one of the best countries in the world on recycling, from a regulation that I was able to introduce in 2009, so just over a decade ago. And the reason that we are now one of the best in recycling is because we had a ratcheting mechanism whereby in the regulations, the public services had to respond with increased outcomes with big financial penalties every 5 years. Now that is also there in the Paris Agreement. So we should be using those ratcheting mechanisms. So what can this institute and its partners offer up to government on how it might change within the next 5 years, that government can turn into regulation that ratchets up for all the industry? Because we will never keep the fossil fuels in the ground otherwise, because we don't see big private investment on the side of the people. It's more likely to be on the side of space exploration as an alternative for those who know that this planet will not sustain life anymore. And that is terrifying.
Which brings us, I think, to a question from Kathy Lynn, who asks, well, she says, first of all, thanks to all for excellent content, hitting some critical points that others slide over. So thank you very much to all three of you for doing that. She says, how do we get the urgency to the masses? When I see disasters occur and the victims are suffering abysmally, someone explains the disaster is due to climate change, but the people in distress don't understand what has happened and how to escape by demanding that politicians take action. How do actuaries, or indeed anyone, get over this barrier? Is it that the media isn't playing their part, or are there other factors going on? Jane, if you'd like to pick that one up first, before we go to the other two on it.
Okay, thanks. Yes, thanks, Kathy. I thought this was an absolutely excellent question. I think the bit that really gives me hope, and this is going back to something Kudzai said at the very beginning, which is it's a very exciting time to be alive because things are moving really quickly. And we know when we look at young people in particular, that actually they not only have a really good understanding of climate, but they expect people to take action on it. And I think that the point that that Alice made about the fact that we are going to see potential migration in the context of the numbers that we have never seen before from the global south to the global north. And if you look at these are real propositions in the context of what potentially can happen in the future. So when we think about how we engage more widely, I think one area absolutely is around media reporting. I mean, I'm actually delighted that the media reporting in the last few weeks in the run up to COP is telling the story of climate. But actually, it didn't do it in 2009. It didn't do it in 2015. So we all have to call on the media to continue to give us those sorts of climate updates. But we also have to include it in education for all our students. And over 70% of our students want to see this as part of their university experience. And that's worldwide. That's not just in the UK. And 90% of students at school age level want to see it in their own curriculum. We must own the problem and seek the solution in a cross-generational way. Because those of us who created the problem, and I'd like to believe that I am a good ancestor in the stuff I've tried to do, but I'm part of a generation of very, very bad ancestors. And I only came to this debate on the basis of living as low carbon a life as I can in the early 2000s. So if you think about, most of my life was spent on the other side of it. Most of my life was spent behaving like any other consumer who's got a reasonable salary. How do we get people to understand the difference? I personally think we need individual carbon budgets. I think we need to trade carbon at the commercial level, because once you start trading carbon, that is part of the level playing field. And that's commercially, but also even if individual carbon budgets are not mandatory in the short term, in the short term, they will help us understand our carbon usage. And I think one of the big issues for me has always been that I have to explain to people that it's energy, transport, buildings and food are the biggest choices they make linked to carbon. And whatever we do at work and we have to do at home as well. We cannot have a differentiation between our behaviour in the different settings of our lives, because it's our children and their children who will receive the consequential disbenefits.
Yeah. Alice.
Yeah, very good questions, and I completely agree with Jane. The role of media is absolutely massive, because there is still way too much disinformation, and I think we should try to encourage and welcome more science-based talking. And we saw with the pandemic here in Britain, the fact that we had scientists explaining to us what was happening and what their recommendation was. I think it made it a lot easier for everyone to accept we need to stay at home and we need to reduce contact. And so if the media are doing more and are continuing with, we see some good, at least on our main media channels and the news here in the UK, some more talking about the climate, and that's very encouraging. We certainly need more of those, and yes, I completely agree with Jane. The point of regulation, if the media and social channels should have a tighter regulation on the kind of information that they spread. In terms of what to do, I'm a great believer in carbon pricing. I think that would be, in a way, the fairest and the easiest, so to speak, solution. Because if you start taxing externalities, depending on the real impact on the environment, not just pollution and CO2, but biodiversity, loss, etc., then there would be a fairly rapid mechanism of adjustment whereby polluting activities would just become too expensive, and consumers would be naturally shift towards lower carbon, lower polluting activities. So but that creates a big policy decision, and it requires coordination, or unless you want to impose a carbon tax border adjustment mechanism, which is probably the way to go, because you're never going to get an agreement from all nations.
So how might this tie into the intergenerational point? I mean, if you charge everybody for carbon, there's a question just coming up. How do you introduce an individual carbon budget without the same issue as carbon credit trading for corporations, where the rich can pay to emit as much as they want and the poorer struggle to adapt? Well, obviously you can do it partly through allowance, that the equivalent of maybe a UBI only for carbon, a universal basic allowance, a universal basic carbon allowance, if you like, that everybody gets a low allowance that's cost-free, as it were. Do you think that sort of thing might work, Kudzai? Or are there other ways that we could encourage people to understand the effect of their own lifestyles?
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for the comments that have been made on this, and and to Kathy as well for bringing up the point. And I just wanted to bring up one example. YouTube very recently, I think in the last week or two, said that they will no longer allow channels that talk about, essentially climate change denialism to monetize their content. And you can imagine immediately what that does in terms of the type of information that goes out. And to your point, Alice, around also demanding the same from other social media platforms. I'm one of those early YouTube users who gets a lot of their information first from YouTube. So that has a big impact. And then also back to the example of the pandemic. If you can teach a 4 or 5-year-old the impact of them not wearing their mask or washing their hands, you can teach them about climate change. I refuse to believe that we are doing ourselves justice by limiting the amount of information that's out there. I mean, 6 months into the pandemic, there was a pamphlet everywhere. There was a sign everywhere about washing your hands, wearing your mask. There were statistics everywhere, and we have not done the same for climate change. That's just a fact. So when we talk media, we're not just talking social media, we're not talking just TV or what's on the radio. Is the information in front of people all the time, every time. As much as we've been brainwashed about everything else under the sun, perhaps it's time for us to start brainwashing each other around the impacts of climate change and making sure every generation understands this. And so if we then go to your point around individual carbon allowances, and unfortunately, you know what, we can't trust everyone to do the right thing. And I believe that we are going to have to use both carrots and sticks to get people to behave appropriately. So, for example, like you said, you can have a cost-free carbon allowance, and then there are penalties for going above that, whether it's in the form of a tax. You can use a proxy of things like your electricity bills or your fuel bills, or your travel expense allowance that you get from work. I think there are many proxies in our environment that can show us the type of damage that we're doing to our environments. We just haven't applied, once again, our minds to the problem at hand. But I definitely do believe that there's a way to price individual carbon usage throughout, I guess, most at least emerging and developed nations, at the bare minimum.
Without overly disadvantaging the already disadvantaged. I think that's one thing that's really important. Yeah. Moving on, thinking about this, how do we get people to be aware and care? We have a question in from someone who I know is a very expectant father, fingers crossed for, I think it's next week or the week after. How do we practically get people less at risk, e.g. pensioners, to engage more to support those more at risk, e.g. newborns? Jane?
Speaking as a pensioner who has a newborn granddaughter, I mean, I think the fundamental element for me is actually, how do we all, I keep going back to this point, but it's, I don't, this idea of sort of saying individual groups, it's about how do we all change our behavior? And then we ask individual groups to be part of that. And I think one of the critical issues for pensioners is actually not necessarily being aware of investment opportunities in this area. So I know that I am a small investor, but I invest in renewable energy provision. And I invest in that across 4 or 5 different companies in the context of both wind and solar. And I've chosen that as my contribution, as it were, knowing that what I do therefore creates more wind and solar. So as a pensioner, but also I get a very good return on investment at a time when there's not much return on investment around. Yeah. So I think it's a situation whereby, how do we encourage people to realize that where there is opportunities for that kind of approach, that they need to be advertised really, really widely. But I think what you'll also find, and it goes back to some of the points that Kudzai was making a moment ago, and your question, Louise, about individual carbon budgets. If we set individual budgets from the north of the world, then actually there would be way more capacity than the average person living in the global south would ever use in the context of that individual carbon budget. And this would be a wonderful egalitarian message. And this actually plays over into the sort of ecological footprint. And I think that keeping this idea that actually we have a debt in the global north, and that therefore when we set our footprint, we need to set it at a place that actually recognizes that where we're using the equivalent of anything between 3 and 7 planets worth of resources in every year of our lives, most countries in the global south are not even getting up to 1.5 in terms of the number of planets, and most are well under 1. So actually it would be one of the most egalitarian mechanisms possible in terms of both setting individual and a countrywide country. And it's not so much whether or not, for me, it's a tax. It's about you are all much better on this call in determining how that could best be delivered. But I just love the idea of the budget type proposal, because we all understand monetary budgets and having carbon budgets that we understood in the same way. So I think going back to that pensioner, and good luck, you who are going to get your newborn shortly, and let's together try and create a wonderful world for them to live in. And the biggest single thing that we can do to do that is all make decisions that factor future generations into the long term, because that is how we make a world that other people can live in the future. Because what we've done so far is we've sent our problems down. So, you know, from in the negative sense, we're bringing them into a world of climate problem. We're bringing them into a world with nuclear waste that we don't know what to do with, etc. And we have to make sure that from now on, governments, whenever they take decisions, cannot take decisions that leave a waste or additional carbon problem into the future. And that is the critical point of the work on COP, not just on climate, but for the person who said they didn't know what was going on in Glasgow, there's another conference in Kunming in China on biodiversity, and the two things have to come together. So the very best thing that we can do if we think about future generations is contribute to as many trees of the right kind in the right place to celebrate future generations, and similarly in all other aspects of our climate life, in energy, in buildings, in transport, in food, take the actions necessary, either by use of individual calculators or by the use of commercial metrics such as B Corp or One Planet Standard, which we recently introduced for companies in Wales, in terms of doing everything you can on that journey to bring down your carbon and ecological footprint.
So let's go to Alice and then Kudzai.
It would be great if everyone shifted behavior like Jane is suggesting, and I really hope that we're gonna start seeing more behavior along those lines. But I just think that it's not enough, and we haven't got enough time to allow for everyone to start shifting behavior. And let's not forget that there will be a certain section of the population that just not necessarily can afford it, and will be by necessity be drawn to the cheapest alternative. And now in a lot of places, especially in poor countries, coal is still too cheap. They won't have the, if you give them the option to buy renewable energy, but that's more expensive, they're just not going to do it. So I am going back to the principle of taxation. I think you need taxes. And in answer to the question that is, it's a very good question on how do you get pensioners to pay off, to contribute to newborns. I mean, ultimately, I think you have to tax wealth as well. And so that pensioners, especially pension funds, I mean, the amount of money that is invested in pension funds in the world is staggering. We're talking about an extraordinary amount of money. And so if you start on one side regulating very tightly pension funds, so that we know, for example, that there's TCFD that is coming. Is getting into law for pension funds, etc. It's not just about disclosure; it's about how they are invested as well. So how they're financed. So trying to stop them from financing polluting activities. On the other, if you impose a carbon tax whereby polluting activities, damaging activities for biodiversity as well. And I'm completely there with Jane. I mean, it's the other half of the story. It's just we can reduce emissions, but if we lose our natural capital, we won't survive. Half of world's GDP is estimated to depend on nature in one way or the other. And then you need a redistribution mechanism so that the poor section of society can be helped, because otherwise, it's absolutely right that if the choice for them is to eat or not to eat, well, the transition will have to incorporate the just elements, as we call them, just transition. Poorer elements of society will have to be helped by a redistribution mechanism.
Kudzai.
Yeah, so I wonder if I can take some liberties and match this up with another question that I think frames it slightly differently.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so, okay, so this question is about essentially pensioners versus newborns. And there's another question around R&D investment. So, to Alice's point and what I said earlier, some of the largest pools of institutional funding in the world sit with pension funds. And there's also mention of investing in R&D and innovations that, I guess are more climate friendly. And that second question says danger of too much focus on controlling the downside, and how do we help tackle climate change by innovation? For example, positive impact investing, like I talked earlier. Because if I think about it, how many pensioners actually invest their own money? I don't know about you, but most of the pensioners I know don't have a clue about where their money is sitting. And then one day they retire and they're told this how much you'll get every month, and they get a check in the mail. There's some more financially astute pensioners, but most of them aren't managing their own money. So really the question is around the asset management of pension fund, of institutional pension funding. So the young versus old is really asset management and pension funds, and investment into new technology that is climate friendly. And a lot of the investment into, climate friendly technology is really happening around the venture capital. And in some cases, I think later stage private equity sort of growth capital. That's where most of the investment is taking place. Again, there could be a lot more from government, but currently that's what pension funds put money into private equity. There's been, talk of recent, potential changes in regulation in the US as well. We're starting to see it in the UK, under consideration, particularly, I guess, on the private debt side in South Africa. So we're starting to see them think about it because they've seen the returns, they've seen the potential, especially for things like endowments from colleges. There's money to be made. And it definitely helps some of the countries still dealing with things like defined benefit schemes. So I guess the question is more so, how do you encourage more innovation around climate change? And the answer for me, at least, again, is private capital. And I think part of that also has to do with how do we put a value on the potential of climate-friendly innovation. And a lot of that has to do with mindset. It's not just numbers in a fancy Excel workbook. And I think part of that is what is the longevity that we think that less friendly technology or existing mechanism or infrastructure has versus new ones, because that informs the valuation on your investments and your potentials for exits and the longevity of some of that technology. And so I think the role of actuaries, I think, in this space is also, how do we drive a discussion where climate is not just sort of like, we need to give away some of our returns because we want to do this nice thing, but to say that actually investing in climate-friendly technology is a financially sound and prudent decision to make, because that will outlast anything that we are currently doing. So again, I think, we can break this argument down to numbers, to logical arguments that investors, asset managers, capital allocators can understand and rally behind. So I think that's how I'd approach it. Anyone who is influencing any kind of institutional capital in the pension fund space, you've got a great opportunity to put a great argument forward that you can back with numbers.
I think that's right. And there's also, we tend to look at investment returns as being about the numbers, what percentage yield you get over what term and so on. The trouble is, if we all invest in the bad stuff, so if we all invested in thermal coal, for example, because we think that the short-term returns are great, which I'm just not going to go into because I'm probably not at the moment. I don't follow that exact argument closely enough. But supposing we did, we might be increasing the sort of headline yield now, but over the long term, what we're doing is destroying the world that we want to be living in order to spend the money that we're going to earn. So we have to think of it in that bigger picture, long-term way. And that's certainly something that I think actuaries should be doing. We should be pointing out the risks of, if you take these investment decisions just in terms of the monetary return you get now, that money may be useless when the people, the beneficiaries, need to spend it, if the world has changed so much that they can't spend the money on the sorts of things they thought they wanted to spend it on. So I do think that it's again, this is another sort of risk way of looking at it, that you have to look at it in the whole rather than just on the sort of narrow, the narrow ground that some people would like us to look at it. It's just really important to look at the bigger picture. There's lots more questions coming in. I hardly know where to start, I admit.
Can I quickly?
I can't
quickly make a comment, Louise, while you're going through the question.
You're breaking up a bit, but let's continue trying.
Hello?
Yeah, go on.
Oh,
no, I'm afraid we've lost Kudzai for the moment.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
in the US, sort of okay. Oh,
Yeah.
I was saying one of the things I've been following quite closely is the US infrastructure bill. It's one of the largest we've ever seen. And I've been really thinking about the role of climate change and everything that we're seeing happen, from a climate change perspective in the US, and how they're allowing for more climate-friendly infrastructure as they're going forward. And I think there's some lessons to be learned, and I'll be watching closely to see how they to structure in the long was a key consideration making the change right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kudzai, I didn't catch a lot of that. I think looking at all the questions, we've got questions about how do we convince people to live a lifestyle that's probably less comfortable that they're currently living. That's a really important one. How do we, many countries are very dependent on tourism, and I know that this applies, for example, to the West Indies, which is also, of course, an area of the world where is most susceptible to the physical risk of climate change. How do we get the millions who travel to realize that they need to do so in a net zero way, which is going to change the way they experience the tourism? How do we get those of us who are very lucky, very privileged, to realize that probably we're going to have to be a bit less lucky in future? We're going to have to downsize our expectations. Alice, what do you feel about this?
Yeah, it really pains me, but I just can't see how in the future we will all have better standards of living and better and bigger opportunities. It just, we're pushing the boundaries of the planet. We can't get all 8 or maybe 10 billion people in the world to travel around the world on holiday, and at this given at these prices now. It's I think air travel, for example, is going to have to be a lot more expensive. How do you help countries that live off tourism now? Well, that's a tough one, right? Because because they are depending on movement of people. I think it's unfortunately it would probably be right if everyone lowered their expectations on how their standard of living can continue to increase. Certainly in developed countries, I know it's not fairly distributed, and I know there have to be mechanisms for a distribution. But it's a struggle to see how we can continue to all travel more and buy more stuff, and buy foods that comes from all over the world, and have more beef. We're running out of space. There just isn't enough space even to plant all the trees that we would like to plant, and all these corporates that announced this net zero plans accounting on offsets and on planting trees. There just isn't enough space in the world for all these trees that they think they're going to plant between now and 2050, right? It just unfeasible. Unfortunately, I think that at some point the time of reckoning will come, and but it's I struggle to see how we can all become richer and buy more stuff and travel more, and it's a tough one. I just can't see it.
No, I agree. I think we have to recognize, and this is, where we've been bad ancestors in many ways, that our descendants are not going to be able to have some of the advantages that we've had, but then we hope that we will be able to enable them to have some other advantages that maybe we haven't, such as, for example, knowing that they are not destroying the world they're living on. It's a tricky one. Jane, and then Kudzai.
Yes, I think this is actually a fundamental question. I've mentioned before that my sort of epiphany around the climate effectively happened in the early 2000s, and when we had our epiphany as a family, We had been doing all the stuff you described. We'd been buying stuff. I don't think we were never particularly great consumers, but we certainly were very much part of the consumption world. We went on holiday wherever we wanted, until I was so shocked about just the impact of air travel. And, you know, we decided as a family, so that was parents and children, 3 children. The youngest at the time was under 10. We decided as a family to do one big green thing every year. And actually, it has not reduced the quality of our life. It has increased the quality of our life. We're doing entirely different things. We don't fly for holidays. We don't buy stuff just because we can. We actively look at what we can reuse, and that becomes an adventure in its own right. We actively look to support our local economy, because that's what's going to keep our school, our village, our town alive. We actively look at where we can get local food, because that enables resilience, both for the local community and for Wales. And we only grow in Wales about 3% of the fruit and vegetables we need as a nation. And yet that is on only 0.01% of our land. So actually wouldn't use much land to produce all of that. So we have been valuing the wrong things. So I think that if you're wedded to stuff, then please, yes, your life is going to change, but it should change for the better, because at the end of the day, I think one of the big lessons of COVID is A, governments can move very quickly, and B, people matter more than anything else in our worlds. And if we want to keep people alive and healthy and resilient, we need to turn our attentions down to our family unit, our community unit, and do everything we can to support that. And what I certainly found personally during the COVID experience is I live in an amazing community that just worked to help each other. And when I've talked to others across the whole of the UK and elsewhere, so many people have had that kind of experience. So it's, in a sense, it's becoming part of the collaborative experience, because being part of a collaborative experience enables us all to bear things better, and also to potentially devise community solutions to some of the issues that will face us for the future. Love is low carbon.
Yeah.
Let's try and support that.
Thank you. Kutsai.
Yes, so I've switched off my camera to help with bandwidth, and I agree 1,000.
Oh, that helped a bit. Kutsai, I'm afraid we've lost you again. I gathered that you were agreeing a lot with what had been said. I think one thing I'd like to say here is just to pick.
Incorrect, but
now, Kutsai, I'm afraid we're just not hearing you properly at the moment. One thing I'd like to point out is that somebody's asked a question saying, so are we saying that going forward we are going to have lower life expectancy? How will we improve health outcomes especially for poorer people, without economic growth? Economic growth is a tool. It's not an outcome that's worth it for its own sake. It's only an outcome if it can provide the other outcomes we need. Health is really important, and it's not only economic growth that can provide good health. It's the state of the environment, for a start, provides good health, good food, easier stress-free lives, all those things. It's not just money that gives us the answer here. We're really running out of time. Just a last, 30 seconds or so from Jane and Alice, and we'll try Kutsai again. Jane.
Those people on the call today, there are still nearly 100 participants in this virtual room. I hope if there's anything that any of us have said, because we've all been speaking with the same themes in mind, if anything any of us has said has touched a chord with you, go away today and take one action, or at least one action, that actually makes you part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Thank you. Fantastic. Alice.
I'd like to say something to students. And when you're pushing your universities to divest from fossil fuels, from their endowment, it's not in your interest. Your endowments and yourselves should remain invested and should push these companies to transition. When you sell fossil fuel holdings, you are just passing the problem on to someone else that doesn't care. You've got to remain engaged, power of engagement.
Engagement, action, really important from Jane. Engagement, really important from Alice. Kudzai, let's see if your connection's returned a bit better.
Yes, I think it should be a bit better now. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so the point I was making before is simply that modern day consumerism is in and of itself inherently extractive. And living large doesn't mean you're living well. And buying all the things doesn't mean that your quality of life has necessarily gone through the roof. And much like I said before, as much as maths and statistics are largely natural sciences, a lot of what we do, we've defined for ourselves. It's man-made, whether it's the definition of returns, whether it's how we view risk in the short term or the long term, we have the power to redefine, reimagine and redefine how we look at the world. And as actuaries, we're in a very privileged position. As hard as this qualification is to get, I could still consider it a privilege to be an actuary and to be considered a trusted advisor and to be able to see the world the way I've been trained to see it. And it's important that we start to engage, not just in our minds, but genuinely in terms of taking action on the long-term consequences of our actions and the long-term potential of very different types of solutions. So I guess, yeah, my call is really to the actuaries in the room, the actuaries in yourselves, in your minds, to use this privilege to do right by the next generation.
Wonderful. Action, engagement, and do right by the next generation. Difficult to improve on that. Thank you so much to Jane, Kudzai, and Alice for their time and their contributions to our discussion. They've given us a lot to think about. I'm certainly going to be thinking a lot about some of the points that have been made and seeing what I can do about them. Thank you, of course, to our sponsors, our platinum sponsor Milliman and our sponsor Star Actuarial Futures Limited for their support. The next event in the series is on Thursday, this coming Thursday at 8 AM UK time, where I'll be joined by Bronwyn Clare from ClimateWise, Sharanjit Padam from Finity Consulting and from Australia, so special thanks to him for the time difference point, and Karen Tan from Swiss Re, and we're going to be looking at insurers, and especially we're going to be trying to focus a bit about what positive actions insurers can take, not just about divestment, not just about ceasing to underwrite, but what positive actions insurers can take. So do join us on Friday for that. You can register for this event and others in the series via the IFoA events page. All these events are going to be available to view on Catch Up sometime soon, I hope. Please fill in the feedback survey QR code on your screen to enable you to do that. And again, many, many thanks to Jane, Alice, and especially to Kudzai, who we couldn't hear everything she said, but what she did say was very inspiring and thought-provoking. So thanks to you all, and hopefully see some of you on Thursday too. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.